Capturing, selling, and buying slaves. Slavery has existed throughout the world from ancient times, and trading in slaves has been equally universal. The transatlantic slave trade is perhaps the best known. In Africa, women and children, but not men, were wanted as slaves for labor and for lineage to Europeans. They were then transported to the Caribbean or Brazil, where they were sold at auction and taken throughout the New World. In the 17th and 18th centuries, African slaves were traded to the Caribbean for molasses, which was made into rum in the American colonies and traded back to Africa for more slaves. The transatlantic slave trade is perhaps the best known. Slave trade began around the mid-15th century when Portuguese interests in Africa moved away from the fabled deposits of gold to a much more readily available commodity, slaves. By the 17th century, the trade was in full swing, reaching a peak towards the end of the 18th century. It was trade which was especially fruitful since every stage of the journey could be profitable for merchants. The infamous triangular trade. The Atlantic slave trade essentially worked like a triangle between Africa, Europe, and the Americas. Trade goods such as guns and textiles were sent out of Europe and traded in Africa for slaves. The slaves were crammed into ships that crossed the Atlantic in order to provide labor for large plantations in North and South America, which were growing cotton, sugarcane, and tobacco. These regions of North and South America were European colonies for much of the Atlantic slave trade and served to provide raw materials to Europe for manufacturing. The slaves were sent from Africa not only to North America, but also to the islands of the Caribbean to the east of South America.
How has the slave trade influenced today's society and history?
It has influenced modern day, but because in some places black people are given less rights, and in a good way, big countries that were involved in slave trade are one of the richest in the world today.
Was the slave trade good or bad for the European economy?
Yes, it was good because um, labor back then was very expensive, so it was easier to buy slaves and bring them to their country to work on plantations and hard work that was very.
Were people in opposition of the slave trade back then?
Well, most people were not opposed to slave trade because, well, everybody got something out of it.
As a result of the Atlantic slave trade, most people of African descent in North and South America today can account for the family's passage from Africa to the Americas met through the Atlantic slave trade. About half a million slaves out of 15 million in total were sent to the southern United States. Approximately half of the total slaves went to America, went to the Caribbean. About a third of them went to Brazil. Indeed, as a legacy of the slave trade, Brazil has the largest population of people of African descent outside of Africa. The Atlantic slave trade had enormous negative effects on the continent of Africa. Many parts of Africa suffered from an increase in violence, drain of people, and an economy increasingly reliant on slavery. Over 400 years, the slave trade had transformed the African continent from coastal regions. However, there is no doubt that the Atlantic slave trade changed the face of the earth in many ways and presented a huge challenge to Africa in trying to recover from this brutal period of history. Finally, the Industrial Revolution in Europe and North America, which occurred simultaneously with the Atlantic slave trade, was fueling a growing demand for free rather than sterile labor. In the early years of the Industrial Revolution, cheap raw materials such as cotton produced by slave labor in the Americas were essential, but the 19th century continued industrial expansion was dependent on flexible and mobile labor force. In 1807, Britain became the first European nation to ban the slave trade. France, Holland, and the United States soon thereafter passed legislation banning the slave trade. Today, slavery is abolished in most countries.